Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Well, MPs return to Parliament tomorrow after recess, and Number 10 will be hoping to take back control of the news agenda because the last week has been dominated by an extraordinary row that seems like it's been directly lifted from the thick of it. The COVID-19 inquiry demanded access to unredacted WhatsApps, which the government refused to provide. But just as they launched a legal challenge to keep some messages secret, Boris Johnson decides to hand everything over and circumvent the Cabinet Office. A decision made purely out of the goodness of his heart, I'm sure, rather than to cause maximum trouble for Rishi Sunak. It does leave you thinking, though, what on earth could be in those WhatsApps? On the programme today, I should say, can't get the days of the week right. First up this morning, I'm going to be talking to the Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick. For Labour, we'll be talking to the Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds. Now, at the start of the GMB Union annual conference, we'll speak to their General Secretary Gary Smith. Plus, dramatically barred from running to be North East Mayor, we'll also be speaking to the current North of Tyne Mayor, Jamie Driscoll. Good morning, welcome to the show today. Now, if you were wondering why Cleo Watson isn't in our opening sequence, that's because we were expecting to have her on the programme today, but unfortunately she hasn't been very well, so we'll definitely get her booked in another time soon. Now, Rishi Sunak has pitched his premiership on the pledge to stop the boats. But let's be honest, that is easier said than done. Well, tomorrow, the illegal migration bill hits the House of Lords, and it aims to stop people arriving in the UK on small boats from claiming asylum. A few moments ago, I spoke to the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. So last July, Rishi Sunak laid out a 10-point plan to tackle illegal migration. How's that going?
Well, we've made a lot of progress in a short period of time. We've already entered into really unique landmark deals with France, which are seeing a big increase in the number of interceptions on the beaches. 33,000 migrants were stopped crossing as a result of that last year, a 40% increase on the year before. We've entered into a gold standard arrangement with Albania that is seeing thousands of Albanian legal migrants returned home and the numbers crossing from that country significantly reducing. We've just entered into an agreement with Georgia. We've entered into one with Italy. And on the domestic front, we've increased the amount of illegal working visits, like raids on car washes and nail bars and so on, by 50% this year alone, all to make it harder to operate in the UK if you're either an illegal migrant or one of the people smuggling gangs. And just this week, I've been in North Africa, in countries like Tunisia and Algeria, taking the fight to the people smuggling gangs upstream before people have even got close to the UK.
OK.
We're increasing the resources of our National Crime Agency through Operation Invigor so that they have the resources to smash the gangs and organised immigration crime. So on every front, we're taking action and we're starting to see the results of that in the numbers crossing the Channel.
I want to unpick some of what you said a little later in the interview, just to try and work out, exactly the progress that is being made. But firstly, you recently said in a speech that people who arrive in the UK on small boats are cannibalising our communities. What do you mean by that?
Well, I didn't say that. What I said was that they risk cannibalising the compassion of the UK public, because what we're seeing with the small boats is a very large number of mostly young men leaving safe countries like France, often having passed through multiple safe countries, coming to the UK and then requiring immense resource here to accommodate, to support and to integrate them.
What do you mean by the word cannibalising, though? Why did you choose that word? It's a very eye-catching word.
Well, I think it's the right terminology that the illegal migration challenge, the small boats crisis, is making it harder for the UK to do what we really want, which is to support people who are genuinely seeking the support of the United Kingdom.
A bit different there. You're saying it's making it harder for the UK to do what they want, but you use the word cannibalising. What did you mean by cannibalising?
Because with small boats, you're finding that tens of thousands of young men who are in a place of safety, who are predominantly economic migrants, are coming to the UK, putting overwhelming pressure on our asylum system and on the compassion and generosity of the British public, and making it then harder for us to support people who genuinely need our help. And what we want to do as a government is devote our finite resources to helping families and those people who are in conflict zones by continuing to do world-class resettlement schemes like Homes for Ukraine, the Syrian and Afghan scheme, by doing our global scheme that works with the United Nations to take people out of refugee camps and bring them in a controlled manner to the UK. If you allow uncontrolled, illegal migration to escalate, then I'm afraid the British public will find it harder to support people who genuinely need our help. And that is why we're taking the very robust steps that we are to get this problem under control.
So let's see how you are getting the problem under control. What's the current backlog for asylum claim processing?
Well, there's over 150,000 cases in the backlog, but we've made a very clear pledge to eliminate the legacy backlog over the course of this year. We made that pledge at the end of last year, and the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and I put in place a robust plan, which is now working.
You say it's now working.
The number of cases in the legacy fall.
Let's have a look. You know, asylum applications are waiting a decision. Like, you're talking about legacy there. Most people just look at the overall cases. It might be one thing that you're starting to bring the legacy down, but if the overall numbers are going up, that's different. You can see there's been a small fall between 2022 and 2023.
Let me just
I think most people would look at this and not think that this is a system that's under control. Do you accept that?
I think the system needs robust reform, and that's exactly what we're setting out to do. We are putting in place processes to streamline the way decisions are taken, to simplify, remove all of the bureaucracy that has crept up in recent years, to double the number of caseworkers making the decisions over the course of this year. And that is beginning to have results, as you can see on the screen, and I'm confident that we will eliminate the legacy backlog. But the key thing to note here is that the sustainable answer to this challenge is to reduce the number of people crossing in the first place. I've just been to a number of European countries. They've all got backlogs of cases, but the way to stop this problem is not to focus solely on the symptoms of it, but is to focus on the cause, and that's why we're pursuing the bill that we're taking through Parliament today.
If I may, the backlog is one element of this. Another element is the number of people who have been removed from the UK. 38,000 failed asylum seekers and foreign criminals removed from the UK last year. That's the lowest number on record other than the pandemic years.
Well, if you look at the stats for the beginning of this year, which is the period after the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and I put in place our plan, we're actually seeing returns back to pre-pandemic levels, and we want them to rise. We've signed an agreement with Albania, which is absolute best in class. We've signed one now with Georgia.
Let's talk about Albania then, shall we? Because as you say, so many people, it did make up quite a large proportion of people arriving on small boats. So how many, you made a big play of the returns agreement you struck with Albania. So how many people who've arrived on small boats have been returned to Albania?
Well, thousands of Albanians are returning to Albania.
I just want to split that, because I know that foreign criminals are part of these numbers as well.
Well, many of those have also arrived on small boats originally.
If we're just talking about people arriving on small boats, how many have been returned to Albania?
Well, there are hundreds of Albanians who've arrived on small boats who have been placed on those flights as a result of the processes we put in place and the agreements that we've reached with Albania. And you only have to look at what's happening.
Hundreds. How many people have arrived from Albania overall?
If I may just make this point, Sophie.
And I'm just trying to get to the figures,
well, if you only have to look at what's happening to the number of Albanians making this dangerous crossing.
This is a different point
that I'm making. Well, it's not, because the two are related. No, the reason that we are returning Albanians is to deter people from coming in the first place, and that is succeeding.
If I may, I'm specifically asking about the number of Albanians who have arrived on small boats who have been returned under the agreement. Because to be completely honest with you, I'm trying to get to the bottom about whether you're trying to cloud these figures by focusing on foreign criminals who've been returned to Albania, or whether this deal that you struck with Albania is actually working.
Well, the foreign offenders, in most cases, are being returned under the arrangement, because what happens, and this is why we need to reform the system, is that even after serving a sentence in our prisons, an offender will then put in an asylum claim. They may then also claim to be a victim of modern slavery. They make spurious last-minute claims and appeals to frustrate our ability to remove them. And that's why we reached this agreement with Albania, that we can remove them. And just to finish the point, Sophie, it is right that we focus on foreign national offenders. You know, of course we want to remove people who have come across on small boats, but we also should be getting people out of our prisons who have committed serious crimes and returning them home to Albania.
I don't think anyone is
wrong for the government to allow those people back into British society.
I don't think anyone's disputing that. I'm just trying to work out how effective the Albania returns deal is. Of the number of Albanians who've arrived on small boats, how many have been returned under this gold standard, as you put it, agreement?
Well, as I said, hundreds have been returned
and that doesn't seem that many.
Well,
what's happened to the rest of them?
Well,
if you've got this returns agreement that means they can just click your fingers and get back.
It was relatively early days.
Have they just disappeared?
It's relatively early days, but also you only have to look at the numbers now attempting to cross the channel from Albania.
What's happened to the other Albanians then? Are they in hotels or do you not know where they are?
Some of them are being accommodated. Some have returned home voluntarily. And some may well have absconded. But that is absolutely the reason why we're taking this action.
So why are there still Albanians in hotels in the UK if you've got a gold standard returns agreement?
There are very few. We're working through those cases and removing them. But what you're getting to the nub of the question here, which is that our system has become riddled with legal processes which enable people to make spurious last-minute appeals. Even the Lord Chief Justice recently made this point. That's why we're putting in place the illegal migration bill that cuts all of this process out in the first place and is based on the very simple principle that if you come across in a small boat, you have no right to live or make a life in the UK. You'll either be returned home swiftly to a safe country like Albania, or you'll be returned to a safe third country like Rwanda. And you won't be able to use our legal system or misuse our legal system in order to frustrate your removal. If we can do that, we will break the people smuggling gangs, we will deter people from crossing in the first place. And with respect to Albania, you only have to compare the proportion of those people crossing the channel in the first quarter of last year to the first quarter of this year to see that this has been hugely effective in creating the deterrent effect that we set out to.
OK. Let's talk about the COVID inquiry, shall we? The government's launched a legal challenge so it doesn't have to hand over unredacted WhatsApp messages to the COVID inquiry. What's it got to hide?
We want to hand over to the COVID inquiry absolutely anything that has anything to do with COVID-19 or the purpose of the inquiry, and that's the right thing to do. This is an important inquiry, and we want Lady Justice Hallett and her team to have access to all the information that they need. Where there is a point of difference is that we don't think that it's sensible or reasonable to hand over documents or messages that have nothing whatever to do with COVID-19. And I'm a former lawyer. I've been involved in discovery requests from courts in the past. And the normal way to do this is to set reasonable parameters to request anything that is related to the case, or in this situation, the inquiry, but not to ask for things that are wholly unrelated, nothing whatever to do with the purpose. Isn't it up to the inquiry
to decide that? If you hand it over, then they can decide what's relevant.
As a lawyer, having been involved in discovery in the past, that's not common practice.
But it may not be common practice, but this is an exceptional set of circumstances.
Well, I can't think of any situation where a court would ask for documents or messages that have absolutely nothing to do with the purpose of the case or the inquiry. I mean, for example, things to do with a civil servant or indeed a politician's private life that are wholly unrelated to the inquiry.
But do you not trust the inquiry to decide what's relevant?
Well, it's not a question about whether we trust the inquiry or not. We have the highest regard for Lady Justice Hallett and her team. We're not asking for special treatment for the government. What we're saying is that we should uphold common legal practice, which would be applied in any civil case in the British courts and should be applied to this inquiry. We think that's very reasonable. I hope that this can be resolved, indeed, before the matter even gets to court, and we want to continue to cooperate productively with Lady Justice Hallett to resolve it.
Boris Johnson, of course, bypassing the Cabinet Office to send his WhatsApps directly to the inquiry. Why do you think he's doing that?
Well, it's entirely up to the former Prime Minister how he cooperates with the inquiry. If he wishes to send his documents or WhatsApp messages to them, then he's at liberty to do so. I think a letter has been sent from the Cabinet Office to him to say that as he is using taxpayers' funds to pay for his lawyers, then that funding has to be used for appropriate purposes. But he can advance whatever arguments he wants to and make whatever statements he wishes in his witness statement to the inquiry. There's absolutely no sense that the government will restrict what Boris Johnson wants to say. But if you use taxpayers' funds, obviously you should make sure you're using them appropriately.
I mean, some would say that this comes down to the relationship between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, maybe not the most helpful course of action for the former Prime Minister to take. Allies of Boris Johnson have told the Mail on Sunday that they think the reason Number 10 doesn't want to share their messages is because it could reveal Rishi Sunak's plotting to bring down Boris Johnson.
No, as I say, the issue here is a simple legal one, which is, should you hand over material to an inquiry which has absolutely nothing to do with COVID-19? And that's a long-standing practice in British courts. I think it's fair and reasonable that that's applied to the inquiry as well. And I hope that we can resolve this with Lady Justice Hallett very soon. Now, you famously wrote a piece back in 2019 backing Boris Johnson. I think you have a look at it, along with two faces who might be quite familiar to our viewers. You can sort of look in there, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, the former Prime Minister. Do you regret backing Boris Johnson? No, it was the right decision at the time. The country was facing a very serious challenge. We needed to get Brexit done, to end the paralysis that there was in Parliament at the time, and to stop the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, from taking over our country. So I'm sure all three of us fully support that decision. But look, we have a great Prime Minister today in Rishi Sunak. He's getting on with the challenges facing the country, and I fully support him. I mean, you all look a bit more fresh-faced back then, I think, before the sort of political rollercoaster that we've all been on. Rishi Sunak's Prime Minister now, Oliver Dowden's Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, you keep backing the right horse, Boris Johnson, then Rishi Sunak. You're a bit disappointed not to be Secretary of State? Look, it's entirely up to the Prime Minister who he appoints to which job. I've always taken on difficult and challenging roles. This is certainly one of them, but it's one that matters to the public. The public want to see us secure our borders, to stop the boats, and that's what I'm working very hard with the Home Secretary, with the Prime Minister, to deliver. OK, thank you very much. Thank you. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick there talking about how effective the government's strategy is on tackling illegal migration, also saying that it wouldn't be sensible or reasonable for the government to hand over all ministers' messages that have nothing to do with COVID-19 to that inquiry. Well, you're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Up next, we're going to be talking to Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Minister, plus the GMB Union leader, Gary Smith, as well. There we go. And we'll also be talking on the programme later on to Jamie Driscoll. Now, he's the current North of Tyne mayor who was told that he couldn't run to be the mayor of the North East by Labour. We'll try and get to the bottom about what really happened with Jamie Driscoll. Now, as usual, The Take will follow this programme just after 9:30, where we can analyse some of those interviews with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. But Sam joins us now. Sam, good to see you this morning. What did you make of the interview with Robert Jenrick?
I think it reflects what I suspect is quite a growing amount of nervousness about the small boats issue inside Number 10. Rishi Sunak has made solving the boats, stopping the boats, one of his big priorities, and him and his ministerial team, like Robert Jenrick, have been out many, many times, including this morning, to talk about it. But the key point, Sophie, is that the legislation is still in train in Parliament. In other words, nothing has actually happened yet. And the fact that Rishi Sunak has gone out to bat on this issue so much has actually created the perception, a perception that I know Number 10 are worried about, that they've started to take action. But in fact, all they're trying to do at the moment is try to pass a law. And what that means is that for all ministers like Robert Jenrick talk about this issue, nothing yet has changed. So this summer potentially is going to be very difficult. There are still, as the weather gets warmer, as the conditions get easier, going to be people crossing the channel in those small boats. And the limited action that's been taken so far isn't really working. I mean, it was an extraordinary section of that interview where, as you highlighted initially, Robert Jenrick slightly obfuscated when you were asking him about the Albanian returns deal, and then conceded that only hundreds of people have been returned who actually came over on small boats in the first place, and that the rest are in hotels or potentially have absconded. And therein lies the rub. It's an admission, and you saw that admission very starkly this morning after careful questioning, that even the bits of even the changes that they have made are not making substantial differences. And there's no guarantee that the main thing that they're trying to do, which is this major piece of legislation, as you said at the top of the programme, heading back to the House of Lords tomorrow, or in the House of Lords tomorrow, is going to get through unscathed. We don't know how long this legislation is going to be held up by peers. We don't know what kind of changes peers are going to demand of MPs, but what we do know is that everything that they want is going to mean that lots of time is. It's going to take lots of time for the government to get what it wants. It doesn't look as if we're going to get this legislation passed before the summer. It's not clear when the first flights back to Rwanda are, and it's not clear that the measures taken so far are particularly effective.
Yeah, I was quite keen to pick him up on the Albania stuff because, the government always points to that deal as being completely key to their strategy when it comes to illegal migration. Best in class is how Robert Jenrick described it. And yet when it comes to the numbers, when you start digging down into them, it feels to me like they're trying to basically sweep that under the carpet because they're frankly not as good as they hope they are. Sam, while I've got to get your take on the ongoing WhatsApp drama. It does feel like this is something that the thick of it writers went completely off the walls with. What on earth is going on, and what do you think the outcome of this is going to be?
But being completely honest, one of the things that's going on is that for the, rather like parents with kids in school, for the last 8 days it's been recess in the Houses of Parliament, which means that MPs haven't been around. And what's interesting is that there's been a vacuum that Number 10 hasn't been able to fill. To be honest, Labour hasn't been able to fill. And so quite a lot of it was dominated by this rather odd story about the government trying to stop some WhatsApps being released to the COVID inquiry. I think the motivation of what's going on from Boris Johnson's point of view is pretty clear. I think what he wants to do is put his WhatsApps in the public domain, and they're, of course, in large part going to be WhatsApps with Rishi Sunak and people in Rishi Sunak's government. And I think he knows that there'll be episodes like the Help Out to Eat Out scheme that Rishi Sunak pushed back in 2020 that maybe in the cold light of day look unwise now and actually end up harming him. There'll be other conversations that Rishi Sunak had with Boris Johnson that are in those WhatsApps that Boris Johnson handed over to the COVID inquiry that Boris Johnson knows, again, may not look so good in the cold light of day. But I do think just a tiny bit of me thinks that there is a need for some caution. What we're talking about is ministers, civil servants, every single WhatsApp potentially being handed over. And if I'm being honest, Sophie, I don't particularly mind admitting, if all of my WhatsApps were handed over, it would be the most enormous skitfire. And I think that what's gone on is because we've now got government by WhatsApp, people say all sorts of things that are potentially quite unwise on WhatsApp, some of which have nothing to do with their work, some of which do. And because lines have been blurred between personal and professional by this use of WhatsApp, this has created a problem. The answer is probably to stop doing government by WhatsApp. It may take the most ferocious amount of kind of pain endured by a government with every single message being put on display, if that's what the COVID inquiry chair ends up doing, or they end up leaking, for that to be achieved. Because at the moment, the messiness of WhatsApp means that all sorts of things, public and private, get blurred when government is done in that way.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam Coates there. Sam says it would be a skip fight if his WhatsApps were released. Obviously, there's nothing to be seen in mine, completely pure and angelic, as you would expect. Well, let's get the latest now from Labour as Parliament returns this week. We're joined by the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Thank you for being on the programme this morning. So you've been talking a lot about your green energy plans today, with claims it would create up to 500,000 jobs in the next 7 years. So how do you work that figure out?
Well, good morning, Sophie. Look, this is the biggest economic opportunity in a generation, and that is why it is so integral to Labour's economic policy and our plans for government. So the kind of jobs we're talking about, first of all, that is everything from an expansion of offshore wind to solar to new technology in terms of things like tidal and marine technology, but also making sure if we're going to drive electric vehicles, we make them here in the UK, our green steel policy to make sure the steel industry can do the transition towards net zero. Wherever you look, there are opportunities here. Other countries are desperately seeking these and actually are far ahead of us. And we're blowing this opportunity under this government. And that's why everything Labour is putting forward is about getting the most of that, getting the massive potential benefits this country should have flowing to it from this transition. Net zero is about jobs, good jobs for every part of the country.
So this is all part of your Green Prosperity Plan. You want to invest £28 billion a year in that. So, you know, apologies for my maths. Over 7 years, that works out at around £196 billion. £196 billion. So suddenly 500,000 jobs over 7 years doesn't actually sound that great, because that would be, you know, just under £400,000 per job. How does that work out?
Well, look, so we look at it in each component. So, for instance, the resources we've allocated to the green steel transition is around £2 billion of investments required to do that. Gigafactories will gear up over time, depending on how quickly we can deploy those things. But I just want to be clear about something. This government themselves, because of the fact that if we aren't making batteries in the UK, it would be existential for the automotive industry. This government themselves will have to put some money into this. And those are negotiations which I understand are ongoing. But the difference between us and them is that with them, they're not public about this. You can't download, you can't read their industrial strategy. You have to have it explained to you that it even exists. Now, for us, it's an explicit ambition.
Because I'm making a slightly different point here about your plans. And look, you're the guys who people think are going to be number 10 after the next election. So it's right that we scrutinise your plans, not just the government's. £28 billion a year under the Green Prosperity Plan to create 500,000 jobs in the next 7 years. Some people would say that is an awful lot of money to be spending.
Well, look, I think if you look at don't look at the overall headline figure, look at the individual components we're putting forward, whether that's insulating homes, which brings down bills, provides jobs and gives greater energy security to the UK, whether it's making sure we've got a steel industry in the UK. I don't think we can be the first major developed economy that has no domestic steel industry. I think if you look at the strength of the automotive sector in the UK, it is inconceivable to me that we don't seek to make sure we're making the next generation of vehicles, electric vehicles, here in the UK. And fundamentally, every bit of public investment we're putting forward is about leveraging in greater private investment. That is the lesson from what the Biden administration has done in the US. I think the fact that the UK has the lowest rate of business investment in the G7 is a disgrace. And fixing that is not just about public money, it's about planning reform, regulatory reform, fixing the skills pipeline through the changes we'd make to things like the apprenticeship levy. But it will require, in some particular cases, and gigafactories for battery production is a good example, a degree of public investment to do that. But we also know very clearly that the longer term costs of not acting on net zero and climate change will be greater than doing what is required now. But fundamentally, the difference between ourselves and the Conservative Party is about getting the good economic benefits to the UK that should flow from that.
I think people would agree with that overall thing. I think it's just the question mark about the scale of what is being invested and whether or not it's worth it when you look at the number of jobs that will be created. £28 billion a year. And obviously, without wanting to play down the importance of environmental projects, you know, some might say when public finances are tight, shouldn't some of that investment be spent on other capital projects, whether it's hospitals, housing, schools, not directly linked to the green agenda? What would you say to that?
Well, I get asked that a lot, and the fact is many public services in this country are in a state. I mean, there are no public services working better today than when the Conservative Party came to power in 2010. But I have to say that if you look at the root of that, for me, it is the fact we are paying relatively high levels of taxation by historical levels because growth has been so low over the last 13 years. So I see fixing the economy, driving economic growth, good jobs in all parts of the country as not being an alternative or a competing demand compared to funding public services. I see it as being absolutely essential to be able to provide the funding for those public services over the long term. I mean, we are an ageing society. Our pensions bill goes up by about £6 billion a year in real terms every year. Unless you've got an economy that is growing at faster than 1.4%, which is the average it's been since the Conservatives came back to power, you're not going to be able to pay for that. So getting the economy fixed, moving in a more prosperous direction, becoming one of the best performing economies in the G7 rather than one of the worst, that's got to be integral to fixing all the other problems in the country. And the big story around the world is about clean energy. It is about net zero. It is about the economic benefits that we need to gain for the UK from following that path. And that's why it is the centrepiece of our economic strategy.
We'll be talking later on the show to Gary Smith of the GMB Union. He's pretty unhappy with your party's plan to end North Sea oil and gas licences. I mean, if you are all about jobs, isn't that a bad idea?
Well, look, let's take this through the components of the argument. So, first of all, the existing oil and gas fields in the North Sea will run up right until 2050. We're not talking about turning those off or ending that. We are against further new licenses being granted, and that's because it won't do anything for bills, it won't do anything for energy security. It's not a long-term answer to jobs, and clearly it would be a climate disaster, and it requires, Sophie, vast amounts of public money in the form of subsidy and allowances to make these fields economic and attractive. Now, I understand, because I live and represent part of East Manchester here, where I'm doing this interview from in Greater Manchester, and I grew up in the northeast in the coalfields of County Durham. So I understand in the past this country has done economic transitions very badly. And I think Gary is absolutely right to defend and strengthen the arguments for his members to make sure they've got the opportunities they need going forward. Because these existing fields will run until 2050, no one is going to be losing their jobs within there. But we've got to understand that the opportunity in front of us, the number of jobs created from clean energy, is far in excess of the existing directly employed workforce in North Sea oil and gas. So it's not some sort of consolation prize. This is the big prize. This is the big chance to do that. And we'll work with Gary and the unions to make sure finally this country gets this transition well.
Because I know that I haven't got long left with you before you need to leave, and there are another important questions that I do want to get to. Because the Labour MP Geraint Davis has been suspended from the Labour Party after serious allegations of unacceptable behaviour. This was uncovered by Politico's Aggie Chambre. Now, Sky News understands that the Labour Party's Whip's office was made aware of the allegations months ago but didn't take action. Is that right?
I don't know the answer to that question. What I can tell you is I've been part as an NEC member of overhauling the Labour Party's processes across a whole range of disciplinary matters. We've tried and done a huge amount of work to improve it, to put independence from any kind of political considerations as part of that. And I would urge anyone to have confidence in that process and come forward. Of course, we will always keep that under review and try and make it as effective as it needs to be. And there's always more work to do, but I can promise people we've done a great amount of work to try and improve how we respond to this as a political party. And I think the big difference between ourselves and the Conservatives is when something goes wrong with the Labour MP, every time I see it, we take immediate action to suspend the whip and fulfil the processes that we've put forward and do it in the proper manner.
I was really shocked by an interview that I heard earlier this week with the Labour MP Charlotte Nichols. She said that when she was first elected in 2019, she was given a list of 30 MPs to not accept a drink from, to not get in a car with, to effectively watch out for their behaviour. 30 MPs. I mean, I had to check that that wasn't a typo. How bad are things in Westminster?
Well, I'm horrified by a story like that anyone would first of all have to be told that, or that sentiment would even exist. The fact that we have done such a significant amount of work in the Labour Party to try and make sure our processes are better than they've been in the past reflects the need to operate to the highest standards possible. And there are many people we should say in Westminster who are horrified by this, and we're trying to improve that process.
It feels to me like you're talking about the processes that have been improved. The processes can't have improved that much if serious allegations, I'm careful about what I say here, serious allegations about an MP have only come to light because of the work of journalists. It's not come to light because of what your party's doing, talking to people within it, finding out what's going on. What's the evidence that any of these processes are actually making any difference at all?
I think they are, and I think they are the kind of process which can give people confidence because it's an attempt to take out what I think people have felt in the past, which is there may be some sort of political considerations given to disciplinary action when it affects matters of this kind. We've tried to remove that. Now, look, Sophie, there's a lot of work to do, and I understand we always have to keep that under review and try and do it better to respond to cases and make sure in each case we can say this has been as robust as it needs to be. But we have tried, and I think if you look at the immediate action the Labour Party takes when any member of Parliament or elected representative has allegations against them and has fallen potentially below the standard required of them, if you look at the swift action we take, I think that is the right approach. I think we haven't seen that always in the past, particularly from other political parties. We're trying to get it right, and we're always going to work until we can have the absolute confidence we've got the system and the processes in place that we need.
OK. Now, we've got Jamie Driscoll on the show later, who's been barred from standing as Labour candidate for the North East Mayor. Now, his supporters say that this is all part of factionalism in the Labour Party, effectively Keir Starmer trying to purge the left. What would you say to that?
Well, I would strongly disagree with that. The Labour Party is a very large organisation, much bigger, I think, still than every other political party in terms of membership added together. But Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party since he became leader, and part of that process is we have a due diligence process in place, and that's because, frankly, in the past, not every person elected as a Labour representative has met the standard required of them. And specifically, in a case where somebody shares a platform with someone who themselves has been expelled from the Labour Party for their views on anti-Semitism, for opposing the tough action that needed to happen, that would preclude them from being a Labour candidate going forward. Because when we said we'd have zero tolerance of anti-Semitism, when we said we would tear it out from its roots, we're serious about that. And I know sometimes that will cause a row. It's maybe not the expedient political thing to do, but we are absolutely serious about sorting this problem out. Keir Starmer has made that absolutely clear, and no one should be surprised that we're sticking to our word on that.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Reynolds there speaking to us from the Labour Party. Thank you. Well, we heard a little bit there about the debate, shall we say, going on between the Labour Party and one of its biggest supporters, the trade union, the GMB, which says it's time for an honest debate about the effects of Brexit, as well as disagreeing, shall we say, with the Labour Party's policy when it comes to oil and gas developments. Well, speaking at the start of the GMB Union's annual conference, Gary Smith says that politicians from all sides are afraid to admit what impact leaving the EU has had on the economy. Well, we can speak to Gary Smith now. Thank you very much for being with us. I know you were listening along to that interview with Jonathan Reynolds. You, of course, represent an awful lot of workers in the energy sector. What did you make of his response when it comes to blocking all North Sea oil and gas licences?
Well, look, firstly, Sophie, our obsession this week is not with the factional politics or indeed the politics of the Labour Party. My priority is listening to our members this week. The care workers fighting for £15 an hour, the Amazon workers fighting to get union recognition at their sites. Energy will form part of the debate, but I'm obsessed with our members and looking after the interests of our members, not about the policies of Labour. And on oil and gas, quite simply, I think Labour have been naive. They've got it wrong. You know, we are critical friends of the Labour Party, and I think there's just a lack of intellectual rigour and thinking about where they've got to on oil and gas. They're focusing on what they think is popular rather than doing the proper thinking to understand what is right for the country.
I promise I will get on to some of the things that you were talking about at the beginning there. I apologise for the order I've decided to do my questions in. But I do just want to ask a little bit more about the oil and gas. You say Labour are being naive. Why do you think they're being naive?
Because their policies are going to create a cliff edge with oil and gas extraction from the North Sea. It's not going to be up to Labour to decide about investment in the future of the North Sea. I fear that investment's going to dry up more quickly than it should. We are into a process of managed decline in the North Sea, and we should be working together on that. But there is a lot of oil and gas in the North Sea, and the alternatives facing the country are that we either produce our own oil and gas, take responsibility for our own carbon emissions, or we are going to import more oil and gas. And I think workers in the petrochemical sector in Grangemouth, in the Humber and Teesside, in Pembrokeshire and Folly, I think they are going to be very worried with what Labour's saying. And as I say, it's time for Labour really to focus on doing the right thing rather than what they think is the popular thing. And, you know, our members in the energy sector and the construction sector aren't stupid. We've been promised tens of thousands of jobs in renewables, but the truth is those jobs have been created anywhere but the UK. Our renewables infrastructure is getting built in China and Indonesia, anywhere really but Britain.
I mean, Labour's today are saying that they will create 500,000 jobs through their green energy plans. You're a bit sceptical of that then?
Well, I welcome this initiative. I think, there's 13 years of failure from the Tory government. They've got us into the hole on energy, let's be clear about that. But working people in Aberdeen and Humber and Teesside and all those areas that depend on the petrochemical industry, in energy-intensive manufacturing companies around the country, they are going to be worried about the message from Labour. And I just have to be honest with Labour about that. We've been promised that we would be the Saudi Arabia of renewables. We've been promised time and time again that the renewables industry is going to create all these jobs, and they simply haven't emerged. There is a huge wind farm off Brighton here. Where was that produced? Where was all the steel and the wind turbines fabricated? It wasn't in the UK, and that has been the sorry story of the renewables industry around the country. Labour should be focusing on a plan for our energy future rather than talking about bans. And I tell you this, Sophie, I would like to hear a Labour politician now being very clear with the renewables industry that there will be no future developments for offshore or onshore wind until we actually get some jobs and investment in the fabrication and manufacturing jobs in working class communities, because that's what they're doing in America, and I'd like to see that replicated from Labour.
Now, really interesting points that you make in the interviews so far. You started off talking about the priorities going into your conference in Brighton and about pay in particular. We've, of course, seen lots of strikes in the public sector. Just how difficult are things for those on low wages, and how long do you think this industrial action could go on for as a result?
We represent workers in both the public and private sector, and what I celebrate, because we'll never apologise for workers standing up to defend their standard of living. We celebrate the fact that working people have come together, got organised under their union banner to campaign to defend their living standards. The Tories have got us into an absolute hole economically. Inflation going through the roof, the economy stagnating, and working people are saying we are not picking up the tab for the Tory crisis. We celebrate that fact, we welcome that fact, and we're going to talk about it over the coming days in Brighton. There'll be a tremendous energy in this room. The ambulance workers, the health workers, the ones that the Tories said they wouldn't talk about pay with, well, we forced them to talk about pay. And then I'll be speaking to our members in private care who's struggling on, earning pennies above the minimum wage. I'll be listening to them about their demands for sorting social care and getting to £15 an hour for a minimum wage there.
You obviously have members taking strike action in the public sector, but you've also represented people who've seen deals been struck. I'm thinking particularly of ambulance workers, for example, in the NHS. Do you think it is now time for unions to start seriously accepting pay deals with the government?
Well, it's not just about government, it's with any employer. I mean, what we do as a union, the reason we are growing, our union is growing.
If I may, I understand it's about any employer, but I'm just specifically asking about these public sector pay deals for now, if I may.
Well, look, we listen to our members. Our demands are shaped by the priorities of our members. And it's not about the trade unions moderating the demands, it's about the Tory party moderating its behaviour in government and accepting that people are struggling financially and people want a decent pay rise. We had people who were on the front line of the COVID crisis, and these people want a decent pay rise and absolutely deserve one.
You were talking about Amazon workers, of course, in ongoing dispute. Do you think that as consumers we should be shopping at Amazon?
Well, Amazon, the retail business is only part of the company. What concerns me is that they provide a huge amount of services to the public sector. And if they're not going to treat their workers properly, if they're not going to recognise their employees' rightful and legitimate demand to have the GMB recognised on their sites, then there has to be question marks about them getting public sector contracts in future. They make a huge amount of their money from what is almost a very powerful position that they have around providing web services to the public sector, and that's going to have to be challenged as well.
Now, this morning in The Observer, on a slightly different note, you say that politicians on all sides need to start being honest about the effects of Brexit. Of course, if you look at both parties, both Labour and the Conservatives, they say that the debate on Brexit is over. They don't want to join the single market. They don't want to join the customs union. Are you disappointed, I guess, by the position of both Labour and the Conservatives when it comes to Brexit?
Look, I think I travel all around the country. We've got members the length and breadth of the UK and Ireland. I understand that, Brexit's not going to be revisited by the politicians, but there has to be an honest debate about the impact that Brexit has had. It is part of the reason that we're seeing the inflation that we've got stuck in the economy. It is having an impact on investment in the UK, and I just think there needs to be an honesty about that. And looking forward to policies around the future of defence manufacturing, and we talked about green energy, the UK is going to have strong trading relationships with Europe and indeed America, and I think there's going to have to be a reset of our trading relationships with Europe and America, and we're going to have to really start having that honest conversations about the impact of Brexit on jobs and investment here in the UK.
And just finally, Sky News has been reporting this week on the latest developments at Asda. The owners of the supermarket are going to buy their sister company, e.g. petrol forecourts, but the GMB has spoken out against the deal. Why are you against it?
Well, we're concerned about the impact this is going to have in terms of competition and things like petrol prices, but our big worry is about the amount of debt that is being heaped on the Asda business and the long-term implications that that's got for jobs in the company. And let's not forget, we have tens of thousands of equal pay cases against Asda. We think equal pay is going to cost the company about £1.5 billion. And given all the debt, given this pretty opaque ownership structure, who's going to be picking up the liabilities for the money our women members at Asda are due?
OK, thank you very much indeed. Good to speak to you from Brighton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was Gary Smith there of the GMB with some pretty pointed words, shall we say, to the Labour Party when it comes to their policy on oil and gas. Doing quite a bit of Labour this week because the next guest is all about internal wars, shall we say, in Labour as well. Labour has barred one of its elected regional mayors from running for re-election. Jamie Driscoll, who is the North of Tyne mayor since 2019, was told of the decision on Friday evening. I should clarify, this is not to be re-elected as the North of Tyne mayor. This is to run for the new position of the North East mayor. Thank you very much for being with us. So how did you find out that you were unable to run for election?
Hi, Sophie. Good morning. I got an email, and the email said, "Thank you for applying. You are unsuccessful to be taken forward as a candidate." So I've been mayor since 2019, as you said. So the area I cover is expanding. It will bring in other parts. So we'll be covering the wider northeast. I've delivered thousands of jobs. I've built affordable homes. I've implemented a Green New Deal. We're tackling child poverty across 90 schools in the region and expanding that. So when it comes to what the Labour Party needs to project to win elections, which is economic competence, I've got a fantastic track record. And for members not to be allowed the choice of putting me forward as the Labour representative is frankly shocking. And I've had so much support from right across the political spectrum. So what I want is for Keir and the Labour Party to do nothing more than give members the choice of choosing me as their candidate.
So you got the email saying that your application had been unsuccessful. Surely you must have known before that this was going to happen.
Well, no, you can't know till you get the email because that's the decision being told. So you go through a process. You talk to the NEC panel. And we said, look, there's no issue with your competence. There is no issue with anti-Semitism. They were very, very clear about that. And they said it's an issue that because you spoke to Ken Loach, that may cause us electoral damage in future, was their argument. I said, if you think Labour's going to lose an election because I spoke to Ken Loach, he was a really successful filmmaker, and he just produced a film in the Northeast. And I was asked, as part of the celebrations for the live theatre, would you have a conversation with Ken Loach? I said, yeah, of course I will, if it's just about his films, which it was. And that was it. So that's 1 hour of my last 4 years as mayor. So to not let members have the choice and make that decision of do they want me to be their candidate, to me seems wholly disproportionate. If that is the reason, but that's not the reason. They don't give the reasons.
I mean, Labour say that that was the reason that you were not allowed to run, because, as you say, you did share a platform with Ken Loach. You would say that it was just about the films that he made, but at the same time, this is somebody who's been, expelled from the party. And I do just want to read you some of the things that Ken Loach has said, because when he was asked if in a discussion about whether or not the Holocaust happened was unacceptable, he said that history is for all of us to discuss. The founding of the State of Israel, for example, based on ethnic cleansing, is there for us all to discuss. The role of Israel now is there for us all to discuss, so don't try and subvert that with false stories of anti-Semitism. That was when he was asked whether or not a discussion on whether the Holocaust happened would be acceptable. He's also said that the actions of the State of Israel make increasing anti-Semitism understandable. He said, if there has been a rise, I'm not surprised. In fact, it's perfectly understandable because Israel feeds feelings of anti-Semitism. I mean, surely you can see why sharing a platform with Ken Loach may be problematic.
If you want to ask Ken about his views, then do that. I'm not a spokesperson for Ken Loach. And let's be really clear that my combined authority under my leadership has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and references the examples. I've been on Jewish Labour Movement training. I work very closely with the Jewish Leadership Council, visit the synagogues in my region. So this is an entirely separate issue about Ken Loach's issues. You need to take up with Ken Loach. I'm not his spokesperson. But he's produced that. There's only been 3 feature films set in the Northeast in a couple of decades. I, Daniel Blake, Sorry We Missed You, and now The Old Oak. So it is a big cultural significant issue for the Northeast. And to talk to him about films, I think, is entirely justified. I share platforms with all sorts of people. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a platform with Ben Hoochin. That does not mean I endorse the Tories' economic policies.
At the same time, though, so you don't regret sharing a platform with Ken Loach, then?
I regret this entire episode now. The whole thing's blown up. And now Labour members are not getting the opportunity.
But you don't think it was wrong of you to share a platform with Ken Loach?
I think the issues of speaking to somebody about something entirely different from a controversial issue, my understanding is that he's made all sorts of clarifications, and he's not a Holocaust denier. I think he wrote a letter to the New York Times explicitly saying that the Holocaust was a real event, which of course it was. So honestly, Sophie, I think we've got to get the proportionality here. What the public want from their politicians is to get on with things and deliver things, and not to engage in culture wars, cancel culture, or anything like that. I actually think that's electorally damaging.
I guess some people might say that, when issues of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party led to a big distrust by the Jewish community, Keir Starmer's trying to rebuild that trust. That you sharing a platform with Ken Loach, who, I've read out some of the things that he's said when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to Israel and the Holocaust, and you don't really think that is problematic. You think it's right that you talk to him about the films.
I think we should let the members make that decision. Let's trust the Labour Party members to say, do we think that Jamie's done a good job as mayor? Do we think he'd win as an election? Do we think, actually, he's an electoral asset? And I would think you would find that yes, actually, would be the result. There's a pattern of behaviour here, I think, that people who support renationalisation of the utilities, who support stronger workers' rights, are being excluded at lots of stages in the Labour Party, whether that's standing as MPs, whether that's frequently as councillors, people being deselected. I've spoken to mayors, MPs, people who were ministers in the new Labour administrations, all of whom are really worried that the sword of Damocles is hanging above them and they're going to be next.
So you think this is about factionalism in the Labour Party, effectively Keir Starmer purging the left?
I think there's a big issue if you look at what's happened. If you look at some of the things that have happened to me recently, as a sitting mayor, I should automatically be allowed to contact members. I was asking for this for about 2 years and finally got an email from the regional director saying, because you are a potential candidate in a future election, we can't give you it. Everybody's a potential candidate. I've had Labour Party staff ringing. This is way before I spoke to Ken about films, saying, oh, you must disinvite Jamie because there may be an event coming up where there's going to be a selection for the Labour candidate. You know, there is a big issue here about democracy, about should people be allowed. That's how we do elections in a civilized country, isn't it, Sophie? You know, you let people decide, do they want their candidate? Why should you bar someone on the basis of that decision?
I mean, I guess, you know, I've just come back to, they would say that the barring is because of their huge concerns about taking a red line when it comes to anti-Semitism and sharing platforms with people in regards to that as well. I mean, have you read the EHRC report into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party?
You talk about sharing a platform. So, you know, if you, Daniel Blake...
The question was about the EHRC report into anti-Semitism. Have you read the report?
So not the full report, no, I haven't. And I haven't read the full Ford report either. You perhaps got to bear in mind, I'm not an opposition politician. I'm a Labour mayor in power delivering. My focus is on doing good things for the people in our region, not internal Labour Party management. I'm not involved in that in any sense at all, really. So, you know, from 60, 70 hours a week, I'm delivering jobs, I'm building homes, I'm negotiating to get more money in the region, currently negotiating with pension funds to get an extra £2 billion of investment for us. So the Labour Party management stuff. But here's the kicker. The Labour Party's official position on Ken Loach is we do not comment. You know, so you check for clarification, what's the appropriate procedure? And there isn't one. So how on earth are you supposed to avoid sharing a platform with someone that later turns out should be controversial? The general public will look at this and think it's crazy that a successful mayor that has huge cross-party support and Labour members aren't even allowed the choice to vote for him. That's crazy.
So what are your next steps? Is there any sort of appeals process? Are you going to run for another position?
I am still a Labour Party member. I'm still mayor for the next 11 months, no matter what happens. I would like Keir to have a look at this. I would like him to say, look, let's let the members decide. My trade union is backing me. I've got huge support from across the party. I have had a look at the legal routes. It's not at all clear what they are. And then, you know, I really do think that just let members choose who they want as their candidates. That's how democracy works. And I honestly think here, Sophie, actually, that in a two-party system, if you're going to ban people who are promoting socialist views from participating in that, that is really quite anti-democratic.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme indeed. Jamie Driscoll there. Well, busy show today, and things, of course, are really going to be cranking up next week as Parliament returns after recess. Well, that's it this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment, though, after the break, we're going to be running through today's interviews, seeing what we learned. I'll be joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Cates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Hello, good morning. This is Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take, a chance to look back at the interviews that we had this morning on the programme, try and work out what we learned, have a bit of analysis, what it means for the week ahead. The government guest was Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, and there's going to be lots on immigration this week because Parliament is returning from recess. The House of Lords are going to be having their say on the illegal migration bill, that bill that says it will be illegal for anyone to claim asylum if they entered the UK on a small boat. And we're expecting Rishi Sunak to be really leaning into this issue as one of the ones that he thinks might be able to bring him election victory if there is a landing zone for that next year. So we did lots of that on the programme with Robert Jenrick. I was particularly keen to get into the weeds of it, though, to try and really unpick the headlines, if you like, because it feels to me the government spends an awful lot of time talking big when it comes to migration. Rwanda plans, hotels, barges. But if you look at the numbers of what they're actually doing, it feels, shall we say, slightly more limited. And so I was asking Robert Jenrick specifically about the deal with Albania, the returns agreement with Albania, that is, that they refer to as the best in class. How effective is that returns agreement? Let's have a listen.
There are hundreds of Albanians who've arrived on small boats who have been placed on those flights as a result of the processes we put in place and the agreement that we've reached with Albania. And you only have to look at what's happening.
Hundreds. How many people have arrived from Albania
just make
overall?
this point, Sophie.
And I'm just trying to get to the
you only
figures,
have to look at
if I may.
well, if you only have to look at what's happening to the number of Albanians making this dangerous crossing.
This is a different point
Well, it's
that
not
I'm
because
making.
the two are related.
No,
the reason that we are returning
specifically
Albanians is to deter people from coming in the first place, and that is succeeding.
If I may, I'm specifically asking about the number of Albanians who have arrived on small boats who have been returned under the agreement. Because to be completely honest with you, I'm trying to get to the bottom about whether you're trying to cloud these figures by focusing on foreign criminals who've been returned to Albania, or whether this deal that you struck with Albania is actually working.
Well, the foreign offenders, in most cases, are being returned under the arrangement, because what happens, and this is why we need to reform the system, is that even after serving a sentence in our prisons, an offender will then put in an asylum claim. They may then also claim to be a victim of modern slavery. They make spurious last-minute claims and appeals to frustrate our ability to remove them.
Robert Jenrick there. Well, during the Take, we're joined, as usual, by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, to analyse some of the interviews. We got there in the end, didn't we? Hundreds of Albanians. It's not quite the kind of gold-plated deal that I was perhaps expecting.
No, and I think what the interview highlighted really well was the way that ministers kind of dance around different types of statistics in order to muddy the picture. And you managed to cut through that. But essentially, there are three different things. There's the overall net migration figure, the number of people seeking to come and live and work in the United Kingdom, and that's at a record high. And whenever you seem to talk about that, then ministers switch to talking about illegal migration. Now, that is, in the public's consciousness, often an issue to do with small boats. But when you raise issues of small boats, then ministers jump and talk about the kind of criminal illegal migrants and the returns to do with them. And that's what you saw Robert Jenrick doing this morning, because the truth is that returning economic migrants who came across the channel in small boats, well, that just hasn't been going very well. And you have a minister in front of you this morning admitting that some of them are still in hotels and some of them have absconded. And I think that's because for all the publicity around the Albania returns deal, actually using that to deal with the small boats issue is very hard. This is of particular importance right now, today, tomorrow. I mean, it could be as soon as tomorrow that the Prime Minister announces a new returns agreement, or a new deal, rather, with Bulgaria. Now, that's the country on the Turkish border, on the eastern flank of the European Union. Where I think we're going to hear details of a new deal very, very imminently to try and, as it were, stop people coming over from Turkey and potentially making their way to the United Kingdom. Of course, there was that devastating earthquake in Turkey in February, and there are some Home Office officials who think that tragedy could mean that there's a sort of another wave of people seeking to come to the United Kingdom. There'll be a debate over whether or not they're right to do so. There'll be a debate over whether or not we can house them. There'll be a debate about whether or not other countries in the European Union should take those people. But we're about to have the debate, sort of, that we've been having about Albania over a deal with Bulgaria, and that's going to kick off maybe as soon as tomorrow.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, as you say, it's really, really hard to get the policy on small boats right. Even where there is this returns agreement with Albania, it's clearly difficult to return people through it. That's why you've got people sitting in hotels, and that's not even mentioning the people who've just absconded and they can't find out where they are. And this is a country that we've managed to get a returns agreement with. And I guess it just leaves me wondering, you know, Rishi Sunak standing at a podium, stop the small boats underneath him. Is this really a sensible pledge for the government to make?
Well, I think it's probably a pledge that they felt that they needed to make. If they hadn't made it, there would be enormous pressure from backbenchers. It's clearly an issue that riles members of the public, and immigration has played such a big role in our politics, really, for the last 20 years. I can remember it featuring in, back then, illegal asylum seekers back in the 2005 general election, Tony Blair versus Michael Howard. It is a conversation that has run through our politics, definitely ran through the Brexit debate. The problem is, I think the question is, Sophie, did Rishi Sunak make an achievable promise? Because even when you ask Downing Street what stop the boats actually means, which is the thing that he pledged at the beginning of the year that he was going to do, they stop short of saying that means no people coming across the channel whatsoever. So what it is, how you achieve it, what it means in practice, what it looks like, I think at the point at which he said it, none of that was quite clear. And now they're having to race to, as it were, satisfy a promise that at the moment that Rishi Sunak said that he was going to do it, he didn't know what he was doing or how he would do it.
The debate, as you say, on immigration is going to run on, and certainly more this week as well. But I do just want to talk a little bit more with Sam, but we'll play the grab first from Robert Jenrick on the other story that's been rumbling on this week, which is that extraordinary ongoing row about Boris Johnson's WhatsApps, what the COVID inquiry has demanded, what the Cabinet Office is saying is unacceptable. And I did ask Robert Jenrick, is it appropriate for the inquiry to be asking for unredacted WhatsApp messages from members of the government? Let's have a listen to his answer.
The normal way to do this is to set reasonable parameters, to request anything that is related to the case, or in this situation, the inquiry, but not to ask for things that are wholly unrelated, nothing whatever to do with.
Isn't it up to the inquiry to decide that? If you hand it over, then they can decide what's relevant.
As a lawyer, having been involved in discovery in the past, that's not common practice.
But it may not be common practice, but this is an exceptional set of circumstances.
Well, I can't think of any situation where a court would ask for documents or messages that have absolutely nothing to do with the purpose of the case or the inquiry. I mean, for example, things to do with a civil servant or indeed a politician's private life.
Well, that's the Robert Jenrick line. Let's go to Sam again, shall we? We were talking about this earlier, weren't we? And look, I think there will be a certain amount of sympathy for people who say, look, you shouldn't have to give over every single WhatsApp you've ever sent, whether that's private jokes with a colleague, whether it's trying to organise your daughter's swimming lessons. You know, there is a degree of sympathy on that. I guess what some people would say is, surely it's for the inquiry to decide what's relevant or not the Cabinet Office.
Absolutely, Sophie. And it was really interesting in your interview with Robert Jenrick when you said, because look, privately what you get is the worry amongst ministers, amongst officials, that what might happen is if they hand over every single WhatsApp message, then some of them might accidentally leak. Whoops. And they are very worried about that happening. So even if the chair of the COVID inquiry only decides to release a few that are obviously relevant, there will be some people who end up losing out because others in the inquiry perhaps are less trustworthy. Now, I have to say, I've watched a fair few inquiries. I have not seen confidential messages leaked from inquiry staff in the way that some are alleging. So it seems to me that that's a little bit far-fetched and a bit of a sort of ridiculous argument. Robert Jenrick, in the interview with you, was making the case, no, of course we trust the inquiry to handle material sensibly. But the big problem here is that they shouldn't be doing government on WhatsApp. You know, government on WhatsApp is like anybody else's WhatsApp. Sometimes the right people are in the group, sometimes the wrong people in the group, sometimes it's all done a bit informally, sometimes the conclusion isn't really clear. But you've got a whole civil service waiting to implement what decisions are made in government, be that on WhatsApp or however else. So perhaps the best thing, Sophie, is, you know, in the end, if the Court of Appeal decides that WhatsApps have to be handed over and more of the disclosures are made than ministers would like, then we just come to the conclusion that that's tough. They have to endure the pain and just learn the lesson not to do government by WhatsApp again.
It does really feel like that is the lesson, doesn't it? I guess, I remember kind of like a few years ago when WhatsApp felt relatively new, people were using it in Westminster in a way that we hadn't been used to. It felt kind of secret, like private almost, didn't it? Like, you know, you heard this thing called encrypted messages. Does that mean that no one's ever going to be able to access them? But of course, if there was a written record of things, then it's just like any other written record, whether it's emails or a paper that's put in your red box.
I mean, and quite frankly, Sophie, if screen grabs of WhatsApps weren't able to be shared, I'd be, if not quite out of a job, then certainly having less fun, because it is that ease with which you can share screen grabs of WhatsApps that is proving so deadly for politicians of all stripes. I mean, frankly, it's the danger when you use WhatsApp, but it's a danger that every single politician knows, yet they still write silly things on it. It was just, 10 days ago that here at Sky News we did publish the exchange of Tory MPs talking about this COVID inquiry and whether things should be disclosed, with one Tory MP, Jackie Doyle-Price, saying that people briefing against the Prime Minister were in danger of turning the Tory party into a skit-fire. You had that infamous exchange with Andrea Jenkins, who suggested that figures like Simon Burns were letting down the Conservative Party. Simon Hoare, were letting down the Conservative Party. And so people do write incredibly aggressive things, probably intended to be in private, on WhatsApp, despite another part of their brain presumably knowing about the dangers. I think there's a little bit of a bigger point, though, if I may. I think that we've spent 7 days discussing, different parts of the media, discussing this issue of WhatsApps. And for me, this is symptomatic of something that actually neither the government nor the Labour Party have had anything big to say over the last week. If I'm being completely honest, I find that this whole WhatsApp discussion, quite tedious. There's a small point of principle here, and there's going to be an interesting outcome. But the way that Westminster is obsessed over the entrails of this rather turgid debate has probably put quite a lot of people off politics in the last 6 or 7 days. But I think that that's not necessarily even the fault of journalists. I think that's the fault of there not being anybody in either party who sought to set the agenda over the recess period, because there are massive, massive things going on, big tensions inside government, big decisions to be made, and big problems, not least with inflation, the cost of borrowing, and all of those kinds of things that are getting less attention because both of the big parties don't shy away from difficult issues and prefer to kind of pick over the entrails of something that in the scheme of things is relatively trivial.
Well, there's one person who's been seizing control of the news agenda over the last week, and that is Boris Johnson. He's done it pretty successfully, I have to say. Sam, thanks very much for your analysis. We'll have more from Sam in a few moments, plus some of our other interviews from the show. Don't go anywhere.
We've actually had over a dozen drownings in the last 2 weeks, which has coincided with the weather starting to warm up. And our concern is that as more people want to get out and about, as more people want to enjoy the weather, that more young men especially are going to lose their life to drowning. So our message is really, really clear. People's perception of their ability and swimming ability that they might have collected in a swimming pool, which is warm and regulated and has lifeguards on the pool side, it doesn't translate necessarily into cold, open water where there are lots of dangers and hazards. So unless you're well supervised by a lifeguard, we really do urge people not to be getting into the water, especially if they're not used to cold water swimming, especially when it's really hot days. People obviously do want to cool off, but we believe it's a difference of people's perception of their ability to swim outdoors. The issue with inland waterways is they're so freely accessible and there isn't lifeguard cover. Actually, at the coast, we actually see less drownings every year because we know families are heading to the beach, they go into the red and yellow flags where there's lifeguards there to keep them safe. But there is a real issue inland where people have free access to lakes and rivers and they feel that they've got the ability to swim in them. And we see it time and time again every year, and that isn't the case. I think local authorities have in the past tried to restrict access to certain waterways. My experience tells me that people will try and get access to those anyway. Our work over the last few years has actually been to try and work with local authorities and local councils especially to try and set up safe swimming zones that they can be supervised. So there's lots of waterways now in the UK, and we've seen the emergence of open water swimming venues and aquapark sites that are more freely accessible to local people, where they can go and enjoy the water and be safe and supervised. So we believe it's a position of trying to get people to the right area where they can be supervised instead of closing them off, because we have seen in the past, unfortunately, that just doesn't work.
Welcome back to Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take, where we take you back through some analysis of the morning's interviews. Well, on the programme this morning, we spoke to Jamie Driscoll, who is the current serving North of Tyne mayor. He's been barred from Labour for running for the new North East mayor of the party. Now, he is pretty upset about that. Labour have said that the reason for that is because he appeared on stage with the film director Ken Loach, who was expelled from Labour in 2021 over comments he made about anti-Semitism. We'll talk to Sam in a minute about this, but just listen to what Mr Driscoll had to say when I read out some of the views of Ken Loach and asked why he shared a platform with the film director.
Look, if you want to ask Ken about his views, then do that. I'm not a spokesperson for Ken Loach. And let's be really clear that my combined authority under my leadership has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and references the examples. I've been on Jewish Labour Movement training. I work very closely with the Jewish Leadership Council, visit synagogues in my region. So this is an entirely separate issue about Ken Loach's issues. You need to take up with Ken Loach. I'm not his spokesperson. But he's produced that. There's only been 3 feature films set in the North East in a couple of decades. I, Daniel Blake, Sorry We Missed You, and now The Old Oak. So it is a big cultural significant issue for the North East. And to talk to him about films, I think, is entirely justified. I share platforms with all sorts of people. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a platform with Ben Hoochin. That does not mean I endorse the Tories' economic policies.
So Jamie Driscoll there really, I guess, being very defensive about some of those sharing a platform with Ken Loach. He didn't say it was the wrong thing to do. He was explaining why he felt it was the right thing to do. I also asked him what he's considering in response to being banned from running for re-election.
I've had a look at the legal routes. It's not at all clear what they are. And then, you know, I really do think that just let members choose who they want as their candidates. That's how democracy works. And I honestly think here, Sophie, actually, that in a two-party system, if you're going to ban people who are promoting socialist views from participating in that, that is really quite anti-democratic.
Anti-democratic, according to Jamie Driscoll. Well, let's bring Sam Coates in there. I wasn't sure what tone Jamie Driscoll would take in this interview, but he was very, very strong in his defence. He said it was anti-democratic from being that he was not allowed to run for this new position. He didn't express any regrets about sharing a platform with Ken Loach. I mean, he was pretty unapologetic.
Yeah, and it all touches quite an important and deeper debate inside the Labour Party about the way that Keir Starmer is approaching the left. But just on the main points of the issue, I mean, you can see why Labour HQ don't want Jamie Driscoll as North East Mayor, not because necessarily just for the incident with Ken Loach, but a complete failure of political antennae. Look, Sophie, it doesn't take somebody deep in the weeds of Westminster to know that Keir Starmer's singular focus after coming in post-Jeremy Corbyn was to deal with the anti-Semitism issue. He always was going to do that quite robustly, and he has picked this out, marked this out as a territory on which he is going to fight hard and push quite aggressively to expunge what he felt was the stain of anti-Semitism on the Labour Party. So Jamie Driscoll should have known that this was a massive risk. Ken Loach, his name has come up, be he a renowned filmmaker or not, in the differing views exist, but he should have known where Ken Loach sat with Labour HQ, what they thought of him and the dangers of doing this, even if, you know, if you go and ask somebody what your official position is on the guy, they say they don't have one. You should just be able to see from space what might happen if you associate yourself with people like Jamie Driscoll, with people like Ken Loach. And when you read out those quotes from Ken Loach about his views about the Holocaust, about his views about Israel, rather than going, they're revolting, they're disgusting, I completely distance myself, that is not acceptable to say in the modern age, Jamie Driscoll says, I'm not a spokesman for Ken Loach. So I think for those two things, perhaps you can understand some of the thinking down in Labour HQ.
Yeah, certainly can. And like you say, it does feel, doesn't it, like it's a battle that Keir Starmer is actually willing to have. Yes, you've had people like John McDonnell coming out saying that they think it's outrageous that Jamie Driscoll hasn't been allowed to stand. But I guess if the strategy is all about trying to have a red line on anti-Semitism and also distancing himself from Jeremy Corbyn, you could say, job done. Sam, we'll have more from you in just a moment, because I do want to play a couple of other clips this morning, because this morning we spoke with Gary Smith, who's the General Secretary of the GMB. It's the start of their annual conference in Brighton. Now, there's a row going on between Labour and the GMB about whether or not new oil and gas projects should be banned in the North Sea. And you only have to listen to what Gary Smith had to say about that to realise the kind of depth, I guess, of some of that disagreement.
I'm obsessed with our members and looking after the interests of our members, not about the policies of Labour. And on oil and gas, quite simply, I think Labour have been naive, they've got it wrong. You know, we are critical friends of the Labour Party, and I think there's just a lack of intellectual rigour and thinking about where they've got to on oil and gas. They're focusing on what they think is popular rather than doing the proper thinking to understand what is right for the country.
A lack of intellectual rigour and thinking, according to Gary Smith. Well, this is what Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, had to say.
I understand in the past this country has done economic transitions very badly, and I think Gary is absolutely right to defend and strengthen the arguments for his members to make sure they've got the opportunities they need going forward. Because these existing fields will run until 2050, no one is going to be losing their jobs within there. But we've got to understand that the opportunity in front of us, the number of jobs created from clean energy, is far in excess of the existing directly employed workforce in North Sea oil and gas.
Well, that was the row between the two of them. Let's bring in Sam. I mean, wow, a lack of intellectual rigour and thinking. He said, the head of the GMB Union said Labour was being naive when it comes to the North Sea oil and gas. I mean, he was pretty outspoken.
Yes, Gary Smith is an important figure in the Labour movement, and he feels this issue very strongly because he represents tens of thousands of people in this sector. But where his argument gets quite difficult for the Labour Party is that He reeled off lots of examples where renewable projects that Britain uses were actually manufactured overseas, China, India, elsewhere where the cost of labour is cheaper. And this is the fear, right? You can't subcontract the production of North Sea oil to another country. You're going to end up probably using largely UK workers. But that's not the case if you need to make wind turbines, if you need to manufacture other components for the transition to net zero. They can be done anywhere around the world. And it's that offshoring that Gary Smith is saying. It's quite interesting from Jonathan Reynolds. He was running a slightly less combative, more nuanced line. He was saying that there will be oil and gas used by the UK up until 2050. They're only looking to stop new projects, not shut down the existing ones. But of course, Gary Smith's argument, the GMB's argument, is yes, but if you start to wind down the entire sector, then businesses will stop pouring in the money, start closing down things prematurely. There might be gas in the ground, but it's not economically viable to get it out of the ground if companies are no longer investing because they know that there's no future in the oil and gas sector off the UK shore, and that we could end up prematurely and unnecessarily losing jobs. I think there is a concern among the Labour Party that some of their green strategies, their significant £25 billion plus borrowing plan to kickstart green jobs, isn't well enough grounded by the Climate Change Shadow Secretary Ed Miliband in what's economically viable and real in order to convince voters and actually work in government. So I think when it comes to green questions, that's an area that Keir Starmer probably needs to convince his own side on a little bit more before he even gets to arguing with the country.
It does really feel, doesn't it, like there is that question mark over the green policies and the value for money that it brings. Sam, thank you very much indeed. We are out of time. That is it from Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take this morning. Thank you very much for joining us this Sunday. See you next week.